record. All right, perfect. Okay. So today we're going to talk about what we refer to as passive cellular transport. So like if I hear the word passive, I think of like a lazy Sunday, like I might just be watching like Netflix on the couch. I'm passive. I'm not using energy. Okay? Passive cellular transport expends no energy. And well, then the question becomes, okay, if the cell's not spending energy, then how are these particles moving in and out of the cell? Well, the answer is that the cell relies on the concentration gradient. The concentration gradient refers to the fact that particles tend to move from high to low concentration. Now, yesterday we mentioned that this has a lot to do with the kinetic energy of the particles, and that these particles are always in motion, colliding with each other, other molecules, barriers like the cell membrane, okay? And the end result is that molecules have a tendency to move from high to low concentration. When I say high concentration, I mean a larger number, and low concentration is a lower number, okay? Any questions on this slide? Okay. So this is a representation of what I'm talking about. Now, in this picture, on the left side, there are more molecules. The molecules are closer together, right? Now, you have to imagine that these molecules are moving. So as they're moving, they're bumping into each other. Well, they are lower concentration on this side, and these molecules will then continue to bounce into each other and expand to fill this space. Thus, we could say that the molecules are moving from high to low concentration. Okay? Now, if this molecule hits this molecule and goes backwards, that's okay. We're saying the general movement is from high to low concentration. Okay? Now, if I let this system go and I just let these particles interact freely, eventually I would expect that they'd be relatively evenly distributed throughout the substance. Now, that doesn't mean they stop moving. It just means that the relative concentration doesn't change. Okay? So, we said that the type of transport we're talking today is classified as passive because it does not require energy. There are three types of passive transport in living things. The three types are diffusion, which we've already learned about, osmosis, and then facilitated diffusion. Those are the three types of cell transport that are passive. Okay. There are also kinds that are active. So we will learn about those on Monday. So we're not going to get into the active kinds today, only the passive kinds. Now, the next page is a model that represents, oh, sorry, a little definition first. So diffusion is the net movement of small or uncharged particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And just remember, concentration means amount. So a large amount to a lower amount. So,
Wait, can you go back real quick for like 1 second?
you what?
Can you go back for like 1 second?
Sure.
All right, thank you. I don't need it no more.
You're done?
Yeah.
Okay. So on this next slide, I'm going to show you a model of diffusion. So you can see that when you add the sugar cube to the water, all of the sugar molecules start off in that cube, right? So that cube would technically be the area of high concentration. Then, as the sugar molecules start to break apart, okay, eventually they bump into each other and spread out so that by the end, by number 4, they're relatively equally distributed throughout the water. Now, once they get to that point where they're relatively equally distributed, that is when we would say that solution is in equilibrium. Okay? Now, those sugar molecules are still moving, but they're not going to all congregate to one side of the container, right? They're going to stay spread out because they're always bumping into each other. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay? Now, keep in mind, molecules have to diffuse through something, right? So if this sugar cube was just on the table, it's not going to diffuse, right? It's got to be in water to diffuse. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions on this before we move on to the next page? All right, so this is kind of hopefully a little easier to understand when we're looking at it in the sense of like a cup of coffee and you put milk in the coffee, or sugar and you dissolve sugar in water. Okay, but now we're going to apply it to living cells. So if we're talking about living cells, how does diffusion happen? Well, instead of a beaker, you have a cell membrane, which is right here. Okay, and we can break this into steps. So in the beginning, there's a large amount of molecules on the outside of the cell. There are none on the inside, okay? So the high concentration is on the outside of the cell. Over time, the particles collide with each other, and as they collide with each other, they begin to spread out, and some start to cross the cell membrane. Finally, you get to the point where there's roughly the same amount of particles on both sides. Now, they can still be moving back and forth, okay? But generally speaking, they're not just going to all go to one side or the other, okay? They will be relatively equally distributed, and we call that equilibrium, okay? When particles in a solution reach equilibrium, do they stop moving? Correct, they do not. They don't stop moving, they continue moving, okay? Now, below, you're only going to do, we have a lot to get through today, so we're not going to do question 2 and 3. What I want you to do now, on your guided note sheet, there's a big space. There's a big blank space below that last slide. In that space, what I want you to do is draw an example of diffusion. Now, if you're doing really well and like you're understanding this and you want to challenge yourself, draw a picture of diffusion through the cell membrane. If you're struggling still and you're not quite sure you're understanding it yet, draw a cup of coffee and draw like milk diffusing into it. Okay, that's one of the examples that we talked about earlier. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do this, only 2 minutes. The drawing does not need to be super detailed, okay, but we will come back together in 2 minutes.